Our conversation with Alexis Coe is brought to you by Marcus & Mack, a law firm representing injured people. And the book is called You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington. Alexis Coe joins us this morning from New York City. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hey, it's wonderful to have you on the air with us today.
I'm excited to be here.
You're in trouble, though. I mean,
uh-oh.
You Never Forget Your First is the name of the book. That's not how we're supposed to treat George Washington. Alexis, this is a different kind of biography. You sort of tear down some walls for us. And I like how you went back to the original source material that have been used by other biographers down through the years and came up with whole new conclusions that are different from theirs. That get you thrown out of the club, Alexis?
No, actually, it's been amazing. I think that this is how we should approach him. We don't really remember anything about George Washington. I told you couldn't talk about the teeth, the cherry tree, that he was the general, the president. You can't really say that many things. And what's been amazing about this is even when I go to, I've been on tour now for almost 2 weeks, and even when I go to some place like Mount Vernon where I spent the night, and, the audience is full of hundreds of people who go to talks there all the time, they're really excited about looking at him in a different way, revisiting some of these, myths, but also these things that are repeated about his life, about his mother, about his legacy, and just re-envisioning the whole thing and reinvigorating it.
You stripped away a whole bunch, and you actually found a human being underneath all that paint, didn't you?
Yeah, it turns out he's not too marble to be real, which is how almost every other biography, describes him at the beginning. And I think that this is an exciting time in general for history, but particularly presidential history. And there's a real hunger to know him and to know why the presidency looks like it does. He set up all the precedents.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing to me. One of the many interesting things about your book is you really get a sense that this country was built from scratch, and he was one of the real key building blocks of it all. And the way that he was thought of when he was, for instance, first elected president, and the way that he was thought of when he left after his second term, even our great founding fathers, their opinions changed greatly through the course of that presidency.
Absolutely. It's really compelling to read quotes that describe him before he takes office and even during the first term. He was world famous, and he was regarded as the grand unifier and someone who could really control their impulses. There was no hunger for power. He had already given it up once after the revolution, and that was unheard of. We lived in a time of monarchs. Napoleon was not that far into the future. So for Washington to have such self-control and such regard for the country was, universally respected. But then, actually being president and understanding it's quite different than being a military general, it was a little bit more difficult. And the founders are often presented as this monolith. They all got along. They understood everything. They not only understood how the country should be in their time, but how we should live today. And that's simply not true. And I find that actually to be quite comforting, that Washington wasn't perfect, that all of these guys didn't agree on anything. And by the time Washington retired to Mount Vernon, he was only really on speaking terms with one of the other founders, Adams, who, he had declared that he wanted to call Washington His Highness, His Excellency, and he had proposed all these royal titles. So he was sort of out from the beginning, which explains a lot about the vice president's role going forward. But, Jefferson, he was estranged from Thomas Paine, wrote a really scathing open letter. It just goes on and on.
Yeah, it really does. The Great Cincinnatus, maybe not exactly the most apt title. So our image of George Washington is a reluctant leader who just wanted to be left alone at Mount Vernon and, raise mules and run the farm. But that's not quite the case with him, is it? There was ambition there.
Oh, incredible ambition. I mean, I have often thought over the last few years, when Washington was a young man, he was raised by a single mother, and we should think of him in that way that we think of presidents like Obama and Ford and Clinton, that they struggled in their youth. And, not only did he want financial security, he wanted to be important. He wanted to be at the center of his country's story. But remember, that country was the British Empire. And had they just given him the promotion that he wanted in his 20s, I don't know, we might be British subjects today. He really tried hard to impress them. It backfired a few times. He started a little world war called the French and Indian War. And then, he got frustrated, and he became what we call a gentleman farmer, which, of course, is a really lovely way to think about it. But he enslaved hundreds of people. He had a working farm, and he worked, people he enslaved pretty hard to make it profitable. But the British kept taxing him and making it sort of impossible for him to get ahead. So he's really a reluctant revolutionary, which I find so interesting. But during that time, when he becomes general, that ambition is satisfied. He's no longer so impatient. He is at the center of the story, a world story. And that's, I think, when he became so well regarded by the other founders, not just for his success and for winning this impossible war, but for, not being power hungry, for being satisfied.
Yeah, and you mentioned the French and Indian War. So much of that played out right in this neighborhood here in western Pennsylvania, just down the road in Ligonier, in Katanning, in Pittsburgh. That's a lot of the formation of General Washington as a military leader happened right here in our neighborhood. But you mentioned one of the most difficult parts of the whole conversation about George Washington is his relationship with slavery, and it's not what we think, is it?
Well, it's often celebrated. Almost every other presidential biography, I've mentioned that they all start out the same way. He's too marble to be real. How can we get to know him? And then they end the same way on a really triumphant note in which they declare that George Washington became the only founding father to, emancipate his slaves in his will. That's not totally true. For one thing, Franklin did it while he was alive. Another, Adams didn't have slaves. And Washington only freed one man outright, Billy Lee, who he always thought of as exceptional and is also presented by these past biographers as, a way to talk about slavery. But Billy Lee had only been with him for, less than a couple decades. Washington became a slave owner when he was 11 years old. He was till the day he died. Again, only one man emancipated outright, and then hundreds of people left really to Martha's discretion. So imagine, she's a widow. She's living on a plantation. Washington has had his will published because it was a bit of legacy building, and also, he is the most famous man. So they all know that Martha can free them whenever she wants, or when she dies, they will be freed. What happens over the next year is she lives in fear. She, contacts Bushrod Washington, our forgotten Supreme Court justice, who is Washington's, one of his favorite nephews. And she also talks to Abigail Adams about this, which is how we know that she was absolutely terrified. And she does end up emancipating them, at which point families, mothers, fathers, husbands, wives, children, they never see each other again.
Yeah. It's such a tragic part of this whole story of George Washington. Alexis Coe is our guest here this morning on Indiana in the Morning. We only have a couple of moments left. Alexis, you had to sit down and make a decision to write this book, and that this would be the next project that you did. What went into making that decision? I love presidential history, and I often read 3 or 4 biographies together and feel at the end that I emerge with a really great understanding of the man. And it just didn't happen with Washington biographies. And so I felt compelled. I also felt like, presidential history is, we think of it as, dad history. We think about it, they're giant 1,000-page books, and they are read during, they're sold during President's Day and Father's Day. And I think that doesn't really serve readers who are hungry for this, who really want to understand the presidency. And I think if we focus a little less on foregone conclusions, like Washington was very manly, we know that. I mean, there's no debate there, so we don't need to spend 50 pages on it. And we can also entice with different titles and covers and subject matter women, people of color, people who have felt alienated by the genre. But we really need to understand the presidency. There's no better way to do it than through George Washington. Alexis Coe Coe. The book is You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington. You did all of that and much more in this book. It's a wonderful read, and I want to thank you for spending some time with us this morning.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, you too.